Today's episode of the Total Soccer Show is brought to you by SeatGeek. The folks over at SeatGeek have come along and created an amazing app and website that makes it easier than ever for fans to buy and sell tickets. They do all the price comparison for you by searching multiple ticket sites and ensuring that you get the best possible deal. The Africa Cup of Nations may be over. We're going to talk about that in just a little bit. But that doesn't mean your opportunities to watch soccer in a live event are. There are MLS and USL preseason tickets available on SeatGeek, as well as tickets for the She Believes Cup, which features France versus Germany and the U.S. women's national team against England. Best of all, our listeners can get a $20 rebate on those tickets. To do so, just download the SeatGeek app, go to the settings tab and click add a promo code, enter promo code TSS, and SeatGeek will send you $20 after you've made your first ticket purchase. So download the free SeatGeek app and enter the promo code TSS today. And with that said, on with the show. Hello and welcome to Tuesday's Total Soccer Show. I'm Taylor Rockwell, and I am sitting alone at my dining room table. That is not because Daryl Grove abandoned me mid-meal, but rather because it's the ideal place for me to sit down to talk some Africa Cup of Nations. If you're wondering why, it's because computers are helpful. I called up Taimour, who's quickly getting friend of the show status, to break down Cameroon's dramatic 2-1 win over Egypt in the tournament final. We also discussed Gianni Infantino's sofa accommodations, the future of African World Cup qualifying, and the merits of breakfast cereal. Yes, indeed. Daryl and I will be back in studio tomorrow, but until then, here's my conversation with Taimour. Joining me on the line once again, I've got Taimour, who's a reporter for the Africa Report. He's been covering the Africa Cup of Nations, the 2017 iteration, as well as, tournaments past. Taimour, thank you so much for joining me today.
No problem. Good to be back with you.
Yeah, it's good to have you back on. It's good to have you back home. I know you still haven't really slept yet, so I appreciate your taking the time. I imagine you're a little bit tired, so if you go off on a wander in the middle of conversation, I'll just assume it's sleep deprivation.
Well, it was one of those kind of packed flights at the end of a tournament where everyone's escaping, but at the front of the plane, like in front of first class, in fact, in the classiest bit of an aeroplane you can be in, was Gianni Infantino, the FIFA president, on what could only be described as a kind of white leather sofa. So I was bitterly resentful of him as I took my place in economy on a broken Air France seat.
Oh, lovely for you.
I really wish he'd invited me up front.
In my mind, he's also wearing some sort of like silken Hugh Hefner-style bathrobe, but I imagine he was probably just in a suit.
Well, actually, interestingly, Jonathan Wilson, a British journalist, saw him at the Radisson Blu, which is kind of the CAF headquarters, and he was very casually dressed for breakfast in something resembling a tracksuit. So he's a man who can mix it.
Well said. Well, so I know you were at the final. You were covering Cameroon's win over Egypt. I wanted to ask you a little bit about that as well as the tournament as a whole. But I kind of wanted to start with Cameroon itself, which I know is kind of an unheralded team coming into this tournament. A lot of people, I think including yourself, said that like if they even make it out of the group, that will be a positive step for them. So how is it that Cameroon went from being this unheralded team to being the 2017 champions?
Well, that's the question of the tournament, really. Remember, in the World Cup of 2014, they were just awful. There was an older generation of players, including Alex Song. Three defeats, two of them really heavy. Then they were just pretty unimpressive, uninspiring in AFCON 2015. And then Hugo Bruce, this Belgian coach, took over only a year ago, beginning of 2016. And he just got rid of all the older players and said, I'm just going to use players who I find who are young and are hungry. And he was criticised by the Cameroonian press, and no one thought he knew what he was doing. But actually, he just moulded together a team as he went along. And they came into AFCON with players like Christian Bassogog, who now we know is a brilliant right winger who can also play on the left. But in 2015 was playing for the Wilmington Hammerheads in the United Soccer League. So that, by the way, that Wilmington Hammerheads are a team you're going to teach me about, perhaps on this pod.
I believe they don't exist anymore, so that should be a fun conversation. Really? Yeah, they've moved. I think they moved cities. So I think there is a Wilmington Hammerheads now playing at a lower level, but. Yeah, but they used to play.
So he's there in 2015, and then he gets a move to Denmark. But he's one of the stars of the tournament suddenly. So finding younger players and making sure they gel and playing with a kind of exuberance and lack of fear, which Cameroon really did in the final, especially after going a goal down to a more experienced Egypt, was pretty wonderful to see. So they've done it by just going for youth and being brave, and that's why I think a lot of the neutrals supported Cameroon. Obviously, there've been great Cameroon sides of the past, and Samuel Eto'o was in the stadium in Libreville, and he was at the centre of a lot of the celebrations afterwards. But this wasn't a great Cameroon side, but they're becoming a great side, and if they can keep this young team together and keep developing, it could be very interesting in the future. And the final was just really special as well because it was kind of like a Cameroon home game. Yeah, I mean, there were probably 40,000 sellout capacity crowd, about 10 to 15,000 Cameroonians there, both expats working in Gabon, but also just thousands across the border by land and plane, because it's next door, obviously, to Gabon. And so all the kind of Gabonese that came were definitely supporting Cameroon. They're kind of, brotherly friends. They're not really rivals. So it was that kind of atmosphere and lack of fear and youth and exuberance that just carried them through. And that was all crystallized and culminated in that wonderful winner from Vincent Aboubakar 3 minutes from time. And the whole place it was bedlam. It was brilliant.
So in terms of the overall game, I know that late winner is probably a very special moment for Cameroonian fans as well as fans of this tournament. But I'm curious, in your opinion, how captivating this final was as a whole in comparison to AFCONs of years past.
I mean, it's usually there are no goals. I think there will be 5 penalty shootouts out of the last 10, and then 0-0s and niggly 1-0s. So you don't normally get goals. And so we were expecting something really tight. And actually, Cameroon didn't start well. We thought they'd start fast, and they didn't. Egypt looked pretty comfortable and were going at a pedestrian pace. And then when they took the lead, another Salah assist and Mohamed El Neni struck it past kind of the keeper's near post. He might be disappointed with it. We thought, oh no, they might kill it now. This might be a 1-0. And so the worst bit of the game was probably the 10 minutes before half time, where everything was pretty becalmed. But Cameroon came out second half and just bossed it. They looked fitter, they looked stronger, they looked more positive. And Hector Cooper, the Egypt manager, said at the end they were better than us and they were fitter than us. So that a turnaround final is always a good final to watch, right? If the side goes one down and actually they turn it, and for there to be a late winner, and that late winner to be a brilliant goal. And that late winner to come in a stadium where there are thousands and thousands of Cameroon fans. Everything came together in the end, and it made the final pretty special by AFCON standards.
And from what I can tell, I think all but 2 of the players on the Cameroon roster were born in Cameroon. One was born in France, one in Senegal. So do you think the lack of foreign-born players was intentional? Do you think it factored into this? And does that kind of relate to what you were saying earlier about maybe avoiding the bigger names in favor of kind of a younger, maybe scruffier team that has a little bit more to play for?
Well, I don't think it was all intentional, because 8 of Hugo Brous's 30 squads of 32 basically just turned down the chance to play at the tournament, including, of course, most prominently Matip, the Liverpool defender. And actually, Bruce at the press conference afterwards just pointedly said, these guys will regret it now, not being here for such a special moment. So it was a mixture of necessity and choice. But then Bruce has said over and over again that he thinks the team spirit that's been fostered has a lot to do with the fact that these are younger domestic-based players. But then actually remember that the 2 goal scorers, Nicolas Nkulu and Aboubakar, they're both pretty experienced players. Nkulu's playing in France, although not starting a lot these days. Aboubakar's in Turkey with Besiktas, so they're the 2 more experienced heads, and they scored the goals. But for the rest, yes, it is that youth. But and Benjamin Mkanjo, who's been critical actually for Cameroon, and his set pieces were important, and it was his cross that was an assist for the equaliser, plays at Lorient in France. So there was actually a mix there. It's not quite a kind of completely young unknown side.
Gotcha.
And there was just enough experience in there at critical moments to carry them through.
So I did want to go back to the point about Matip and those other players who turned down the call-up. Because, the coverage I've seen has been congratulations to Cameroon, and then jokes about how Matip turned down winning the Africa Cup of Nations to lose to Wolverhampton and Hull City. So I'm wondering, Is it just a clear cut? They just didn't want to play for the country. They wanted to play for their club. Is it a more nuanced situation? Because it just seems like the coverage has been first, oh, they're choosing to play for their club, and that's great. Now that Cameroon has won, it's more of like, oh, it's so silly that they chose not to play. And I'm sure the story is a bit more detailed than maybe a couple tweets are putting out.
Well, Matip in particular had long-running beef, I think, about the way he felt he had been treated by previous managers. So I suppose like you're one of the first questions you asked me was about, well, how have Cameroon gone from zeros to heroes? Mm-hmm. So let's say if you're a more experienced Cameroon player and you've played in a disastrous World Cup of 2014 and been pilloried, and then you have a poor AFCON 2015, mm-hmm. I think that whole period of instability and the chopping and changing of coaches probably made a body of players think, is this worth it at a time when I might not be guaranteeing myself a contract in Europe? And so this always happens at some stage in players' careers where they think, no, I'm going to spend the winter in Europe in order to make sure I'm starting for a team in order to get my next contract, rather than, in inverted commas, waste my time and potentially get injured on a bad pitch in Africa in January and February. The problem is you might miss a tournament where your country limps out in the group stage and you're all vindicated, or you might miss the one where your country writes its name in history alongside the greats like Samuel Eto'o, which has happened this time.
So for those, I mean, for a lot of people, I think it is like that's the name that rings out as Samuel Eto'o. I'm a Galatasaray fan, so I love me some Rigobert song. Obviously, he has long since retired as well. So of the players that you saw playing for Cameroon in this tournament and in this final, are there names out there that you think you expect to see big money moves for in the summer or a couple of years from now? Are there guys who you think are going to be world class either now or in the near future?
Maybe not, I mean, there's rumours going around that Basagog will certainly not be playing in Denmark anymore. But Mukandjo, I think, will stay in France. I think the players playing in France and in Ligue 1 will stay there. So I don't think it's necessarily a case of these players now becoming superstars. And nor is it a case necessarily of this Cameroon side becoming one of the great African sides to be compared with previous ones. Because I think, as we discussed on the pod last time, there's still, whoever won this tournament, there still isn't a great side, one that we think can get to a World Cup semi-final or final, or indeed win it. And the prospect of an African winner of a World Cup is probably more distant now than it was 20 years ago. And so that's notwithstanding that we've seen brilliant football at this AFCON, and actually better football than the last couple of AFCONs, certainly. But there are still structural problems in African football. There are still issues over the number of genuinely elite world-class players compared to, Latin America or other regions of the world, which haven't gone away. So, amidst the fireworks and drama and brilliance of lots of things that happened over the weekend, we can't really lose sight of where the problems are too.
So what could be done in terms of those problems? What could be done to fix them? You mentioned Infantino before. I'm assuming expanding the World Cup and giving everybody $5 million will help with that, but maybe doesn't help with the inherent issues within African soccer.
Yeah, I mean, some things are to do with football and some kind of aren't, right? So the politically and economically, the level of inequality means that domestic leagues are always going to be drained of the best players too early. And so where you have weakened, hollowed out domestic leagues because of the transfer of players to Europe, that affects the coherence of a national strategy for football. So that's not going to change unless there's also a change in the way in which Africa and the world interact with one another. Equally, there are structural issues to do with the way in which the federations work or function or dysfunction, which is also to do a lot with resources and the number of pitches you have and who gets ahead, who doesn't, and whether competence is rewarded or corruption occurs. And that's not just in Africa; that's elsewhere. There's lots of corruption in the developed world, particularly in the federations too, in Europe, as Platini will attest to, and we can say that fear of being sued given recent events. So those are structural issues that remain. And so, like Infantino, yes, his great offer to Africa, first of all, he's doubled grants. And he's also, the expansion of the World Cup will mean you'll have 10 African teams at the World Cup. So we could have an argument about whether that makes a difference, right? Mm-hmm. So will we have, instead of 5 strong African teams at the World Cup, will we have 5 plus 5 who will struggle very badly and won't improve just because they're at a World Cup? But that's certainly part of his offer to Africa. It's also his way of undermining the CAF President Issa Hayatou, and they're kind of enemies, these Infantino and Hayatou. They're not friends, and they kind of sat next to each other, looking fairly uncomfortable during the final. To be compared with 2 years ago, where Blatter and Hayatou were very chummy, although those two also had a fractious relationship in the past.
I see.
So you can't really. There's a lot of political talk at the moment about how CAF needs to change and how African football needs to change, but none of those questions can be divorced from things that aren't to do with football, which are fundamentally about economics and institutions and global inequality.
That was a amazing answer to a incredibly wide open question. So thank you for that. I appreciate that. That saved me about 7 hours of research. So thank you. So then let's go away from politics for a second. Let's go back to soccer, football itself. So you had Cameroon winning, you had Egypt losing. How does that impact their World Cup qualification? Is that something that carries over? Do you think Cameroon picks up confidence? Do you think Egypt is there going to be sort of a referendum at home about what should have been done, about how this team underperformed? Or is it just going to be like, okay, let's get on with qualification. That tournament doesn't really matter.
Well, I mean, it's interesting because the teams are kind of halfway through World Cup qualification, or a third of the way through, and then AFCON comes along. And so Egypt, before AFCON, said, well, we only really care about World Cup qualification.
Right.
And then there are groups of 4, and then the team that wins that group qualifies to be one of the 5 qualifiers. So Egypt had always said they were prioritizing World Cup qualification. So Cooper will, I think, he won't lose his job over reaching an AFCON final, although the press were very annoyed with his negative tactics. And I think that they will qualify for the World Cup. They're with Uganda, Ghana, and Congo in their group, and Egypt have won two of their first 2 games in any event. Cameroon are just pretty unlucky that they're in a group with, I think, Nigeria, right, Zambia, and Algeria. And although Algeria were generally poor AFCON and went out early, they're still going to take points off people. They haven't won a game yet, actually, in that group, but they will take points. So Nigeria will probably qualify, and then Cameroon could miss out. But the real group of death also is Burkina Faso, South Africa, Senegal, and Cape Verde.
Wow.
So given how well Burkina Faso played in this tournament, and South Africa are no mugs, and Senegal, although went out in the quarterfinal, have lots of quality, that's also an interesting group. So actually, having had this discussion of the current groups, it would be a fair, thing to say, well, actually, imagine the expanded World Cup. There would be enough quality to make an impact at a World Cup, because why are we having to choose between Nigeria and Cameroon from one group? Why not have both? Particularly when you have lots of kind of dross, frankly, from Europe.
It's kind of you to say Europe,
the British home nations,
I feel like you wanted to say CONCACAF, but maybe you were aware that you have an American audience right now, so you went with parts of Europe.
No, I just don't know. I just don't know enough about it. But no, that's true. I mean, there are arguments for the expanded World Cup. Right. I mean, I'm not totally against it. And I think the weird bit about the expanded World Cup is that you'll have these groups of 3. Mm-hmm. That's what's freaking people out. They'll be structurally. Mm-hmm. But I think the reason it's groups of 3 is that it means that to win the World Cup, so that you'll still only have to play 7 games.
Right. Yeah. Same time schedule and everything.
But we'll see. I think in terms of African sides, I mean, if it's expanded to 10 African sides, which is the plan by 2026, I think there would be enough quality and there would be enough depth.
Absolutely, and especially because it does seem like African qualifying is particularly brutal. Because as you pointed out, either Nigeria or Cameroon or Algeria isn't going to be going to this World Cup. Only the top team advances. And then as American fans, American supporters on this show, I mean, we were rooting for Egypt when Bob Bradley was there. And to have Egypt, I think, go undefeated through qualification, and they have that one playoff against Ghana, and that's it. They're out. So it does seem like if any continent or any federation is going to benefit from that expanded World Cup, it probably is Africa, it seems.
Yes, and that's part of the reach out. And I suppose Hayatou, who's got a re-election, he's got an election to become CAF president again. He's been president since the early 80s.
Oh, that's nice.
Since the late 80s, I should say.
Job stability.
In March this year, he would say, look, this expansion is part of my legacy. Although FIFA would say, no, this is part of Infantino's kind of new plan for the game. But one thing I was wondering and was talking to people about a lot at the end of the tournament was how much the beef they have with each other is personal and how much is actually to do with substance and policy. And as ever in kind of global football administrative stuff, it's hard to extricate one from the other.
Lovely. That's a fair summary of what a major international tournament seems to be all about, is extricating the politics and figuring it all out. But since you were there on the ground, I did want to ask you, what were maybe your favorite soccer football moments from this tournament? And then what were your favorite non-soccer moments? Because I'm sure you had a fair amount of interesting experiences during this tournament as well.
Oh, on the pitch. I think Burkina Faso, especially the quarterfinal, with Bansey's introduction and also his equaliser against Egypt in the semi-final and that shootout. But the on the pitch memory I think has to be that 20-minute period in the second half of the final where it became as end to end as you'll get in a major international competition final, and the rise of noise and passion in the ground was just really palpable and exciting. And when you feel like a goal is just inevitable somehow, football always frustrates and takes you to the edge of crescendos and then lets you down. But there was something inevitable about that winner. So that will I think, obviously be the abiding on-the-pitch memory. Mm-hmm. Off the pitch, I think it's Gabon. Gabon is a really complicated place. 1.5 million people, very contested politics, corrupt and distorted oil economy. But actually had the opportunity to spend 4 weeks there at a time when they had, before AFCON, they had banned international journalists effectively for 6 months. So the opportunity to go there and speak to the people I spoke to, including opposition activists and politicians and just grassroots students who were, fighting and going on strike in the universities, was a real privilege. And so actually, when you're at a football tournament like this, it's amazing as an opportunity to get under the skin of a country and actually try and find out what makes it tick. And actually, Gabon is a curious place. I think we listed some of them on our kind of Kafkaesque podcast at the weekend. There are things that will surprise you. Gabonese are obsessed with gardening. There are garden centres everywhere. Really? Everyone's gardens are pristine. One of the legacies of the tournament may be the stadiums are going to be unused, but the huge car parks are already being used by local rollerblade groups because it's the only concreted areas that don't have potholes in them. Yeah, there's rollerbladers everywhere. Beachside open air bars with just brilliant Gabonese domestic music. They've got their own kind of hip hop culture here with loads of artists. I've brought home some of the CDs for my friends. So Gabon has so much to offer, and football is just a window into that. And I think anyone who comes to Cameroon in 2019 will learn a hell of a lot about Cameroon as well. An equally fascinating place.
Excellent. Well, from our last interview and this interview, I think you've convinced both Daryl, my co-host, and I to do everything we can to be at the 2019 tournament in Cameroon. So hopefully we'll see you in person there. We
will record a podcast over a beer in Douala then. That's a date in 2 years.
I like that. And before I let you go, because I know you're home, I know you've got stuff to do, sleep to catch up on, other issues to deal with. I do want to ask, I know you are a world traveler, but is there one thing that, when you get back home, is there something that you particularly look forward to? Is it a specific pint of beer, or is it just not sleeping in random different beds?
Oh, no, I'm a huge fan of just keeping moving all the time.
Really?
I get itchy feet, yeah. But I think, what do I miss? Cereal. If I'm away for more than 3-4 weeks, just having, because we've eaten a lot of bread in Gabon, and a lot of pastries, and sometimes you just want some cornflakes and some milk.
Oh yeah.
So actually, when I got back, that's one of the first things I did. I had a bowl of cereal. So these are the simple home comforts.
Yeah, it's funny.
I'll be bored in a day.
It's funny you mention that, because when we were first in Turkey, I remember finding a box of Honey Nut Cheerios, and it was like I had found solid gold. It was the most exciting moment, I think, of my the first 3 months we were there, which maybe says something about me as a person, but such is life.
We're just all addicted to sugar.
Yeah, or that. Or that. All right, well, Taimour, thank you so much for taking the time. I really appreciate it. And hopefully we will talk to you before 2019. But if not, then definitely then.
Brilliant. Thanks, man.
Cheers. Have a good day.
Bye.
You gotta slice it.